like what happens in a lot of times in the United States, a lot of people open their mouth and start talking about stuff they really don't have an understanding of.
I mean, that's not unique to the United States, though.
Okay,
that's a human thing more than anything.
maybe we just have the biggest microphone on it. But
there's no maybe about that.
But it's.
Hello, welcome to Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and in this episode of Call Like I See It, we're going to discuss the way many have seemed to want to take sides, like in an all or nothing fashion, when viewing and discussing the Israel and Hamas war, and how several factors in our society seem to have made this, something more prominent in how people are viewing polarizing or issues with multiple sides. And later on, we're going to react to the premise in a new book, which is called Determined, which contends that humans actually have no free will, which pops up from time to time. But this is, as someone who is, a very serious person, so to speak, and, has written a book on it. And, based on research, based on dealing with other primates and so forth. So something that is at least worth kind of analyzing and taking apart and seeing, where you come down on it. Joining me today is a man who, even when he is dressed down, is sharp as a bow tie. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show him the way you move?
Yeah, man, I got to save that one for my wife, because she tends to have a different opinion about how I dress. But maybe we'll do a show on that one day.
There you go. Now, we're recording this on October 23rd, 2023. And by now, we all know there's a substantial conflict going on in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinian group Hamas. Also, with some fighting, there's been popping up with Israel and the Palestinian group Hezbollah. Now, as we may recall, the fighting broke out after Hamas launched a large-scale surprise attack on Israel that hit defense and civilian targets and killed hundreds and took scores of hostages. And Israel responded with force, as one might imagine when something happens to them. And this is a pretty straight rundown kind of how we got to the substantial conflict we're dealing with. But what we've also seen is that the reaction to the conflict has really divided into two camps that almost are divergent, like they keep getting further and further apart. Many who sympathize with the Palestinian cause have come out not just raising humanitarian concerns about what was happening in Gaza or whatnot before the surprise attack, but also about humanitarian concerns about Israel's counterattack. But they're not stopping there. But a lot of times what we've seen is they're justifying or defending the manner in which Hamas attacked. And there's been, understandably, a backlash to this, with many reducing those, though, who either sympathize with the Palestinian or express any kind of sympathy towards the Palestinian cause as supporters of terrorism. So, as I said, that's kind of people getting further and further apart. So today we're going to look at both of these phenomena and also just kind of how or why this may be happening when, again, the broad strokes seem to be pretty clear, to any person who's looking at this with any level of objectivity. So Tunde, let's start with the former. What do you think about the pro-Palestinian push and the scale that, some, again, might be just humanitarian, others may be by any means necessary type of thing, is coming from certain areas in our society?
I mean, this is, like you said, we're about to walk into a minefield. And there's a 100% guarantee we're going to step on some landmines. I mean, there's such a complex kind of just issue and discussion. So I think you opened it up well there, and I think for those of us who are talking soberly and rationally, I mean, clearly one must delineate current events with the attack by Hamas on Israel and its citizens on October 7th, of this year, just a few weeks ago of this recording. And so there's no defense of that, right? I mean, I think under a normal kind of, if you just look at that day and what happened and how Hamas attacked Israel.
Well, I think that's the question. To me, and to many, there's no defense of particularly the civilian aspects of the attack. But to some, they're saying there is like kind of things have been so bad, they've been treated so poorly that even this, is, this is justified in the sense that they're pushing back against imperialism or colonialism or you know, and that type of thing. And so this is an oppressed group doing, and that's surprised some people, you know, that we've gotten to that. But some people are looking at that seriously and saying, hey, no, this is what you have to do to a colonial first or an imperial first.
What the surprising part, I mean, look, I'm not, it's not uncommon, or we're not used to seeing on television certain parts of the world react that way, right? Like when Iran did leadership between the president and their I guess the Ayatollah, you know, the religious leader of the country, when they're out there celebrating what Hamas did to the Israeli people, or now using this opportunity to also pick at the United States and others in the West. I think we're used to seeing that as you know, just as negative as that is, clearly, to support that type of behavior, no matter what the reason. But I think what we're talking about here, and just for the audience, right, is people have been in the United States, at least. I'll just stick here. I know there's been other stuff going on in Europe and Australia and other parts of the world, but in the United States, I think there's been a bit of a surprise, especially in the Ivy League campuses, for example, that students and young people would be so zealous in their defense of Palestinians. And I think that's where it gets a little bit conflated, where there are people who have genuine concerns about the treatment of the Palestinian people for the past decades, at the hands of what they see as Israeli occupiers, and just the way everything has gone down since, you know, the 1947, 1948. I think those people have been mixed together, and some intentionally, some unintentionally, with people who are celebrating just a heinous kind of act against civilians. And then there's other people, this is a deep and complex subject, that are combining in their pre-existing things like anti-Semitism, right? There's a lot of conspiracy theories about Jews globally and their control over things, and Zionists and all this stuff. So that's why
a lot of language and kind of things that come up when, like you said, when anti-Semitism takes a forefront. We're starting to hear some of that stuff also mixed in to this pot, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's why, to me, it's an extreme. That's what I said. There's landmines all over the place that everyone steps in, because, you know, and that's why it's hard to parse it out, right? I mean,
well, I think though. Well, let me jump in, because I think part of the issue, I think part of it, because you identified there kind of three segments that might look at what happened and not totally immediately in their gut want to just jump on the pedestal, or jump on you know, and then jump up and down and scream and say, oh, that's so messed up, that's so messed up. There's people who just kind of, you know, in the reverse order, you talked about, like, people just with anti-Semitism, you know, like that exists out there, who may not look at this and immediately say, oh, this is a terrible thing. You also have people who, to varying degrees, either have, you know, look at the Palestinian cause, you know, and then look at, you know, what people have called apartheid, you know, look at a very difficult situation that they're in, and have sympathy for that. And so they don't necessarily want to jump up and down immediately and condemn anything that happens right there. And then some people that look at that same situation say, actually, they need to be doing this type of stuff. So that's three different groups. I think the issue that we're seeing is that it's a timing issue. If you are someone who believes that, you know, from a humanitarian standpoint, that the Palestinians are getting a raw deal and shouldn't be treated like they are, then it's not necessarily the best time to bang the table on that right now, you know, like, or right after the initial attack, right? If you do it right then you do lump yourself in with the people who do believe, you know, I'll use the terminology, by any means necessary, that Palestinians are justified by to try to get people out of Palestine or Israel, try to get the Jewish people out of there by any means necessary. If you may not believe that, but if the time you choose to make that stand, or one of the times you choose to make that point, you're going to get lumped in with that, and you just got to live with that. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but you have to understand, from a timing standpoint, sometimes it's a good time to really push an issue, and sometimes it's not, or at least optimal for your message not to get lost, or for your message not to get drowned out. Because the other groups, like I said, there are some people that say, hey, by any means necessary, Palestinians are justified, and I would consider that a more extreme position, and not obviously a radical. That's more of a radical position. And then people who are just, they're just anti-Semitic, and they bring that to the table, and they're like, oh, well, they're just not going to have sympathy from the other standpoint. You have to understand, you're going to get lumped in with that. And so what we see that with the university students, that all of them, some there've been, like whether groups are signing these letters and whatever, and some people have recanted, and we, at that point, it's impossible to know if they're recanting because of public pressure or because they didn't realize, they kind of saw like, oh, wow, like the timing of this made us look like we're trying to say something else, or that we're endorsing this other stuff. The other thing I'll say is that it does seem like there are a lot of people either that are unwilling to or unable to separate out the idea that you can support more humanitarian life for Palestinians without endorsing, quote unquote, by any means necessary, attacks on civilians, hostage taking, and so forth. Like, you don't have to go. And there seems to be this thing where people almost feel compelled. If I take one step in this direction, I got to run all the way to the end of the line. I can't take one step and say, hey, this is that, but still also recognize the humanity on both sides of the issue. And so, and that to me is something I've seen that creates kind of this divergence, like an active move away from where's common ground to, you end up with the situation where you started out just saying, hey, let's make sure we treat these people fairly. And you end up saying those people, like anything that happens to them is okay. And that's not where you want to end up, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, it's look, there's a lot. So I know we're going to address in this conversation things like misinformation and the activity online and all that. But before we go there, I think this is why, to me, this is it's a sad topic all round, right? But because there's just no winners in any of this, clearly, and that's what I mean. Like, I'm watching this kind of from the outside, looking at everybody having these arguments, and I have in my personal life. It's funny, these moments, you learn a lot about people and that you've known for a long time. And I've been surprised to learn that I have some people in my life that have some strong views both ways. I have friends of mine, good friends that are Israeli, that some are more moderate, some are very aggressive right now. They want to burn it all down. And I've got other friends of mine that I've been surprised to learn they're more anti-Semitic than I knew before, or that I might be comfortable with now. Like, I've got to make some of those choices in my life right now. And in difference to some of the other culture, I was going to say culture wars. I think that's putting a little bit too simply. This Palestinian and Israel thing. This isn't just a culture war.
Well, culture war implies kind of triviality,
correct.
Like,
that's what I was going to say. Yeah. This is a true culture war in that way.
Yeah.
You're right. We make it trivial here in the United States, our culture wars. This is a true one. The two cultures that are very similar, Judaism and Islam. I mean, Islam does stem from Judaism, as much as maybe someone don't want to acknowledge that. And Israelis and Arabs have been neighbors now for decades, and Jews and Arabs have been neighbors for centuries. It's not like there were no Jews before Israel existed in the Palestinian area, and so that's why this is very serious, because I realize this has a combination of many things, right? Religion, which is very important to humanity and human beings, and our emotional values are based on that. Then you have the recent geopolitics post-World War II in the region and all that. And then you've got three of the world's biggest religions outside of maybe Hinduism, just because of the amount of people there are in India. But other than that religion, the other three largest religions in the world call Jerusalem, Bethlehem, those areas, their holy land. And so
they all have an important place, basically in those religions.
And so what I realize is this is being broadcast around the world, and the majority of the world has some sort of emotional stake in this. And because I've thought a lot about things we've been through in our country in recent years. I thought about this, even though it's very different. I'm not trying to make comparison, but just as in relation to, let's say, the George Floyd summer. Again, kind of cultures come clashing in a sense within the same country. And people who have been living next to each other, but with very different experiences of the same system. So, that's why I say, like, for a lot of Black Americans, there's always going to be sympathy when you hear of another group that is being, I don't know how to put it. I don't want to use the word apartheid because I think that's a little bit too strong for what is going on in the United States.
Well, I mean, but that's an assumption
But
on
yeah.
your part that you would assume that, you know, an oppressed people in one setting would always relate to what could be seen as an oppressed people in another setting.
Well, I think
but that's
there's
not
a
always the
little
case,
bit
though. You've
easier
pointed out even,
affinity.
well, but you've also pointed out, though, like, you don't always see that with immigrants, for example. You know, like when immigrants, like a lot of times the xenophobia overcomes that, you know, and it's like, so, you know, a lot of times where you think people would come down on this, it doesn't always line up. And your point about that, this, what we're talking about here in particular, what we've seen a lot of ink spilled about and press about is not oppressed people voicing support for Palestinians. It's a lot of the tension's been on people from privileged areas, you know, the Ivy League schools, you know, that are doing this. And I think that caught a lot of people off guard. It wasn't necessarily the people who you might look at as an oppressed group that were marching in the streets necessarily for Palestine. It was people who aren't necessarily coming from that scenario. And so I think that also played a role kind of in what we're going to talk about in a second with the backlash, and just that when things defy, it's interesting, you know, like the Dark Knight, the movie from a while back, there's a lot of gems in that, you know, in terms of just kind of how, you know, the Joker, you know, the observing people. And it was like, one of the things from that is like, if things go according to plan, even if the plan is horrible, people don't really react that much, you know. But when things don't go according to plan, even, you know, regardless of how serious it actually is, it just throws people off a lot. And so I think the fact that we're talking about Ivy League students, that's not the quote unquote expectation of who should be lining up and voicing support for Palestinians. And I think that threw a lot of people off. And I want to ask you about the backlash, because the backlash we've seen has been very interesting from the standpoint, like we've seen, you know, people getting doxxed, you know, like trying to put all these people information out there, and then that comes with threats and so forth. We've seen people not wanting to, if the universities weren't sufficiently critical of the students that did, you know, voice support, then people want to withdraw their donations from these universities. We've seen people called for, you know, and we've actually seen some job offers being rescinded for people's names who are on documents that you know, with offering support for Palestine. So we've seen a lot of, you know, a substantial backlash. So, you know, just kind of, what do you, when you see the backlash, you know, like, what do you think about, you know, just what comes to mind with that?
No, that's good, because that helps me finish off the thought I was on, because that'll explain my thoughts to the backlash here, because that's where I was going with this was, and I'm glad you stopped me in my botched comparison to here with the George Floyd summer. But the reason I brought it up is because that's something that was very culturally sensitive in the United States. But, you know, I know there were solidarity protests with BLM and all that summer, but in general, other countries don't have the same cultural nuances we do. But what I'm saying is, because this represents something that's in the Holy Land, and that all three major religions pay attention to what's going on around Jerusalem and all that, and there was a long history of things like anti-Semitism, there's a long history of the culture of tension between Arabs and Jews in the region and all that, is that this one now is like, it's like one of our cultural war issues, but on a global scale, with everybody looking at it at the same time and everybody commenting. So going back to now the point of the backlash, I think you make a good point that, like you said, when the plan, even if it's a bad plan, when it fails, that's when people aren't, you know, people kind of take notice. And I think you're right. In a certain way, that's what I feel like what happened when we see these Ivy League schools protesting in support of the Palestinians. And
the students at the Ivy League schools,
sorry, it's the students. You're right, not the school buildings themselves.
Not the universities themselves haven't necessarily been releasing tons of statements on that, but the student organizations and so forth.
Yeah, and that set me thinking a lot over, you know, just watching this stuff, because I thought, you know, number one, you know, like you said, I'm going to give some deference to some people in those crowds. Maybe they didn't realize what, you know, maybe they really genuinely are talking about the Palestinian long-term stuff and all that, and not necessarily what happened 2 weeks ago on October 7th. But I think, you know, at this point, 2 weeks into this, people that are still protesting against Israel, I think, are pretty aware of what Hamas did at this point. And so we all can make our assumptions about what's in their mind. But I think I started thinking about, like, well, how would it look if we had a small group of college kids on campuses protesting in support of Dylan Roof or Derek Chauvin after the killing of blacks, whether it be at the church in 2015 or George Floyd when he got murdered in 2020. Just what would that look like? And not so much what would that look like, because that is what it is, people protesting and having their own way of communicating how they feel about something. What I'm more thinking is, if the schools took time to have a response, how would the country react to that if we had kids protesting that Derek Chauvin as a police officer was being mistreated for being seen as murdering George Floyd, and let's say Harvard University or UPenn just was silent about those kids? Yeah. I don't think it will be received well by the majority of American public, especially Black Americans. So that's where I just
but those are two separate statements, though. Whether it would receive, the Black Americans aren't the majority of the American population, not even close. So are you saying it wouldn't be, obviously you're saying it wouldn't be received well by Black Americans or majority of Black Americans. Are you saying it wouldn't be received, you don't think it'd be received well by the majority of Americans as well?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be received well. I think, whether the media and those, I think a majority of Americans would say, yeah, there's something slightly uncomfortable about trying to defend someone who just murder somebody in cold blood on tape in the open. And I think it's the same thing about defending the Hamas's actions, that we've seen that they did something pretty heinous.
Let me throw something at you, because I think that's an interesting point, in the sense that goes back to the first point I made today. It's the timing of it. Like, it's one of those things that right when something happens, your immediate reaction and your reaction in the immediate aftermath is going to define, it's going to be looked at, viewed differently than necessarily if you look at it 10 years later or 20 years later, if it's like, oh no, I was in favor of this. Like, an example of this is kind of like just the Confederacy, who was a rebel group against the United States. And there are many people, if the people in 1865 were like, yeah, go Confederacy, it would have been looked at differently now than people doing that now, because just time has a way of, it's not as raw of a wound to be like, how could you say that right now? And so a lot of times people talk about things in the abstract, like, oh, okay, yeah, this is once a lot of time has passed, and it doesn't evoke the same emotional response. I think, though, where I wanted to go with this, actually, or one of the thoughts that kind of stood out to me, is the backlash itself is, I think it's similar to the pro-Palestinian push, in the sense that we have different kind of mindsets that we're lumping in one pot here. Like, there's a humanitarian backlash. Like, what in the world? Like, we've just seen those civilians getting killed, civilians getting taken hostage. You guys are supporting that? Like, from just a humanitarian standpoint, that's offensive. Like, so you have that part of the backlash, but you also have backlash that, like I said, some people look at any support of the Palestinians as support of terrorism. And so there's some of that. There's an anti, quote unquote, Muslim, like, where there's, the Muslim, like, people, a lot of times there are people who look at the Muslims as pro-terrorism, something like that. So there's an anti-Brown backlash as well. Like, we're a part of that as well. And I'm not saying anybody who questions what Hamas did, or doesn't support what Hamas did that, or anybody who's looking at the Ivy League school universities, or other people who have voiced support for Palestine, is in all of those groups. But because myself, like, I'm skeptical and not supportive of what the Ivy League students are doing, from a humanitarian standpoint. Like, and it's just like, yo, you can't do that. Like, it's just, when civilians are getting killed, that's not, like, that's not part of the game to me, or it's part of that's not part of war to me, so to speak. If Hamas is trying to make these changes or whatever, they're not going to get me on their side by killing civilians. Like, that's just not going to happen.
But let's be distinct here, because I could hear someone already saying, yeah, but the Israelis are dropping bombs as you're speaking on civilians, yeah. Right? So that's what makes
there's 2 points there. They could also point out that there have been many verified claims of Israelis going into Palestinian lands before this, and with settlers going in and killing innocent civilians as well. Like, so you can point to both sides. And honestly, that's where we came down, if you recall, our initial show. And just like, and you said it already today, there are no winners here. Everybody has blood on their hands here. But it's not like, in the same way, I'm not going to say, if Israel, now, if they're targeting civilians, that is a different thing. I do distinguish targeting civilians than civilians being, the casualties, so to speak. I think that's different. It's not much better. It's still civilian death, but they're targeting civilians is a different level. It's a higher level of egregiousness. I think many people would look at it in that way. So ultimately, though, I think you have to make the attempt if you're looking at this and trying to be fair, trying to be reasonable, trying to look at it from the standpoint of preserving human life. You can't, on one hand, say anybody who voices support for pro-Palestinian. I mean, they need to explain that, though, to me. It's like, what are you saying? You're supporting, going in, knocking out civilians or taking hostages or whatever. You supporting just generally, hey, we got to do better by these people. And then in the same line, or the same in the same thing, saying, okay, anybody who's pushing back against the pro-Palestinian push, that backlash, like, okay, well, is your concern the callousness towards a potential humanitarian issue, or is it some of these other things? And so grouping everyone together that kind of are one side or the other is kind of our specialty as human beings. So that's a big ask, but I do think it's important to keep in mind that there are these different elements inside these different kind of these divergent pushes that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think that's why, to me, I start thinking, because like you said, just this topic of the Palestinians and Israelis is so complex, and the tit for tats, and each side can point at enough that the other side's done to justify for their own side and their own kind of people that support their side to be able to say, that's enough for me to internalize that. This is why I'm right and my side's right and the other side is wrong.
Almost no matter what happens, we're right. Like, no matter what we do, because of anybody or everybody can point to blank, fill in the blank, and say, we have to do like this because they did that.
This is why it's so sensitive, because it involves religion as well. I mean, look, you can, I mean, people take it back, to the old days, right? That the Jewish temple was sacked in Jerusalem in 100 AD by the Romans, and the Jews have always wanted to get back to their home. In the meantime, Muslims, that religion developed, and they've occupied that area for a long time and feel it's their home. That's why this is way deeper than other issues that most of us have ever dealt with, especially us in America, and especially if you don't have either an Israeli background, a European Jewish background, or an Arab and Muslim background. If you're in the United States without one of those three, then you basically really don't have an emotional connection in this way that those people with those three, one of those three, or a combination of those three lineages feels about this. And that's why also, like we say about these Ivy League protests and all that, I mean, like what happens at a lot of times in the United States, a lot of people open their mouth and start talking about stuff they really don't have an understanding of.
I mean, that's not really unique to the United States, though. that's a human thing more than anything.
Okay, maybe we just have the biggest microphone on it, but
there's no maybe about that.
But it's just, but that's kind of my thought there, is because what I've tried to do, even in preparing for today, is think about what other things are very sensitive to us. And that's why I appreciate you bringing up like the Confederacy, because, we look at these other parts of the world, other countries, other cultures sometimes and say, well, how come they can't get it together? How come they can't just solve this? And then we have our own issues in this country that look at how we behave on this stuff. I mean,
and they're not 1,000-year issues, like issues that have been going on for 1,000 years.
Issues that people live through. Meaning go talk to somebody in their 70s or 80s, and honest people, no matter what kind of side they're on, will tell you how the country was prior to 1965. And so,
and there's fights now, like, oh, we can't teach people about the civil rights movement.
That's
and
where
stuff
I was
like
going.
That.
Is that this Palestinian-Israeli conflict actually justifies the teaching of history in a raw and an unfiltered way, not to try and teach it in a way that somebody doesn't feel bad. Because I'm sure that this history with Palestinians and Israeli, I'm positive that, just like we've been saying here on the show, there's enough from both sides that somebody can feel bad if you say something about the other side. And that's pretty much what we're watching here, is that everyone's pointing fingers at each other, and everybody's saying that the other side doesn't know what they're talking about, or I don't want to hear what they have to say. And I feel like, in another world, you look at the state that we live in Florida, we have 2023 has seen basically the school board of Florida basically change its curriculum on history and about certain facts about our history and certain facts about who participated and how they participated in the country's history. And then there's other stuff they've changed about the actual state history. and who's participating, who hasn't. And I think that, you know, we look at these things and it seems like, oh, well, over there, they can't get it together. And, you know, the way we're behaving towards each other here in general topics, we should look at the Israel-Palestinian conflict as a warning that at some point, when you demonize, you know, the quote unquote other side or your opponent, even though you're neighbors, you may end up in a situation where you just can't coexist without violence. And that's a shame.
That's an excellent point. And even tying it to the need to teach history in a certain way, because essentially, if you're going to teach history in a way that won't offend a certain group of people, or, you know, won't let, you know, like then what you're doing specifically is failing to give them perspective. You are radicalizing them, because imagine if, well, and this may be the case, but if people in Israel only learn about they never learn about things that Israel might have done that weren't good. They only learn about bad things that the Palestinians, have done. They only learn about that. And then, you know, they're going to, in their minds, be much more radicalized as far as what it'll take, what they should be doing to the Palestinians. If they don't learn any perspective, like, oh, okay, well, Israel kind of did this, that was too much, but then the Palestinians did this, that was kind of too much. They learn to handle the complexity of the relationship. And when it comes time to try to create a way forward that doesn't involve shooting, then they can be better equipped to deal with that. If they only learn one side of what's happened so that they don't feel bad, then they're not going to be able to do that. On the reverse side, if Palestinians only learn Israel did this, these settlers, they come in, they do this, you know, Israel bombed here, and then this happened. If that's all they learn, they never learn about anything that a Palestinian group, Hamas or anybody might have done that was messed up, then again, they're being radicalized, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And so along those same lines, what's happening here in Florida, for example, will radicalize people, because what they will never learn the complexity of the issue. And when complex issues come up, they won't be able to handle it. They'll reject it. They'll retreat to their corner and say, I only want information that makes me feel good, because when I was a kid, I only got exposed to things that make me feel good. I never got exposed to something that was like, ooh, that makes it a little more, you know, that makes it a little more understanding why there's this friction here, or why this group did that. And so you handicap people. You know, and that's, like you said, that's a great warning for the direction that some people here in this country are taking it right now. And whether it's intentional or unintentional, they're definitely setting up to radicalize people to where they become so self-righteous. They become so self-righteous because all they're aware of is things that would support their own mindset or position. So, that leads me actually to just the kind of the information environment that we have. And there's two kind of phrases I want to throw out, or phrases I want to throw out. One is misinformation, you know, and social media specializes in misinformation. Misinformation travels faster, is promoted more, everything. There's also, just setting aside the idea of information that's incorrect, there's also just the information silos, which kind of plays into what I was just saying, where you only learn about what the other side is doing bad. You never learn about where your side might have done something that was regrettable. And so, you know, and then how though misinformation, information silos, and then also just human psychology. How do you think that plays a role in what we're seeing as far as how people are, again, people are seeing different things, but the general idea of what has happened is pretty straightforward, but we're seeing these divergent kind of mindsets going. What do you see about that? Or what do you see when you're looking at that?
Yeah, I think look, there's nothing abnormal with what we're seeing, in the sense that the race for information is always the first, you know, or what the truth is, like the first casualty of war. And there's the fog of war.
They said that before social media came around.
Yeah,
that
exactly. was So that's what I mean, is that with the modern ecosystem of internet, social media, the regular media, all that, we've already seen how disinformation can spread quickly, and how it can radicalize people, like we've seen domestically here in the United States with some of our people that have done violent things in the name of politics and all that. Remember, we had the former Speaker of the House, her husband was attacked by a dude with a hammer.
Yeah.
Because he was ginned up and radicalized online about politics. And then what happened? Just like now, is not like everybody stood back and said, you know what? Families are off limits. We're all Americans here. Let's, you know, we've elected these people, you know, we can yell and scream at them, but, you know, people shouldn't break into their homes and attack, 80-plus-year-old people that are just because they're married to the politician. That's not what happened. It was a typical, just like with this Israel and Hamas thing. One side, the Democrats, was all upset, and all their media was upset. And the other side on the right made it like it was a joke. And you had people, influential people in our body politic, like Elon Musk, who owns,
a media
X,
company,
formerly Twitter, and the wealthiest guy in the world, chiming in and saying, giving oxygen to a conspiracy theory that they were gay lovers.
Which
and so my point
is a
that,
deflection. I want to give, which was a deflection, an attempt to say that this was justified or defended for other reasons, basically. Yeah,
and so that's what I'm just saying is that when we look over at Israel and the Palestinians and all that, it's a good lesson for everybody. I mean, this is about humanity, right? That we all are susceptible to going down that type of dysfunction in terms of how we relate to each other. That's the Balkans. Like you said, that's the Confederacy against the Union. These things aren't in a vacuum just because it's over there. Yeah. And I think that the way that we are, and that's why I guess I'm saying is that we're seeing now this disinformation and the use of it as a weapon now at a global scale at one time, looking at this conflict, where before we've seen it in nation states, whether it was Brexit or, like I said, stuff here. But this is the first time like the whole world's on this stuff. And it's just interesting.
No, for sure. And what stood out to me about it. I just want to
read this to show you how interesting this is, because it reminds me of, again, Israel seems like got a little bit complacent with their, in terms of intelligence collecting and all that, and just relying on the fact they were a bigger player and they had a big budget to spend on all the fancy toys and military and intelligence stuff. But I'll read here. There's a gentleman named Rafi Mendelson, who's the vice president of the Israeli bot monitoring firm Cyabra. He said more than 40,000 fake accounts have pushed pro-Hamas narratives online, and thousands of them were created a year before the attack. That's what I found interesting, is how in advance this was planned. But think about that.
This was a part of the campaign. This was a part.
That's my point. Like, I heard of them training with the hang gliders and
and they had mock villages and but
that's what I mean. Sorry,
physical training though.
Physically training. That's what I'm looking for. That they were doing the villages and all that for a year before. But this shows you that the importance of information warfare, right? Yeah. That for a year before, they were setting up fake social media accounts so that as soon as this happened, they could go and proliferate. I mean, 40,000 fake accounts will get to millions of people within a few hours.
Especially if they've been designed and curated for the purpose of maximizing exposure with people who might have a sympathetic ear. And I mean, to me, I think that's actually a big point here, is that all of this stuff is implicit in our humanity. Like people have a desire for simplicity. And so that's why a lot of times conspiracy theories or, like conspiracy theories play oftentimes on the desire for simplicity. There's a big bad, there's a hero, and, it's Marvel Cinematic Universe at that point. And, and so we have that desire, and so that's always played, like as media advanced, whether it be the printing press, whether it be, like just pamphlets or whatever, information has always been a part of, and disseminating information, making one side look all bad and one side look all good and stuff has always been a part of it. The thing that is new, or that we should take note of, is that social media is just much better at this than anything we've ever had in before. Not unlike the printing press allowed for people to be better at it, and other type forms of mass media, like another big jump being mass media, you go to radio, TV, and all that kind of stuff. But social media is just much better. And that's something that we're going to have to reckon with, because we have to ask, what kind of society do we want? When mass media, which was a substantial jump in efficiency and efficacy from the print media that existed before, the United States put a lot of regulation on the distribution of information on mass media, fairness doctrines and all this other type stuff that was out there that really prevented those forms of media from being used in ways to overtly manipulate people. We haven't done that with social media, and social media is something like the creators of it. They know, like social media is something that it can expertly be used to do what's called to cause imperceptible changes in your own behavior. It can change you without you knowing it. And so as long as, you know, it's untethered to any kind of regulation or anything, then we subject ourselves to continually be radicalized. And again, that's whether it's misinformation, but that's also one of the things social media does, is it puts us in information silos where we only will see, it doesn't want to show us things that we'll disagree with, because its goal is to keep us logged in. And if it shows us stuff we don't like, they know we're liable to log out, you know? So it creates a very dangerous environment where what we do for entertainment is going to radicalize us, you know, if we're not careful. And because it's imperceptible changes of behavior, even if we are careful, it can radicalize us. So to me,
it's interesting. It's like a cigarette, but for the brain.
Like
seriously, like cigarettes, you know, I guess tobacco is a plant. I don't know how addictive or not that is, but once the companies put the chemicals in, right?
The extra stuff.
It makes an imperceptible changes to your health. But 10 years later, after smoking a pack a day, you know, you're coughing up a lung and you're not well.
Yeah, it's perceptible at that point, but it wasn't perceptible any way along the
your first or second cigarette, you didn't know that you were starting to go down that road.
Yeah. No. And so, you know, like, I know you had one other thought. Did you want to get to that one?
Yeah. I mean, it's just the I mean, kind of on this vein, like you're saying, of the social media and kind of, you know, the world we live in. I think one of the things that makes this more difficult is, you know, just history and science has shown that images are very powerful to human beings. And I think that's why this is just a different time now and we got to be very careful of how we move forward as a society.
And images / video, you know, like,
and that's what I mean by, you know, like you're saying about the regulation of public airways and the way it used to be done with media. I mean, I think we need to. And this is where it's difficult to have a conversation about regulating content and speech in a country that we revere the First Amendment, freedom of speech. But kind of like the cigarette analogy or some forms of food, you know, at some point.
Well, cigarettes, drugs, alcohol. I mean, even television, like I said, television and radio was subject to certain. It's not regulating what you can say; it's regulating how you present information, and that's the same kind of thing here. It's not regulating what people can say; it's regulating whether you regulate the algorithms or you make people disclose the algorithms as far as, hey, what are you doing here? How are you putting this stuff in front of people?
That's the tough thing, because I always feel like the tech companies will be one step ahead because they'll disclose something they did 3 years ago, and then they got something new that's already going to beat that. But besides, you know, that being beside the point, I think that you know, what I was getting at was that's the new hurdle we have, because when I go back to like sharing my anecdotal stuff about, you know, I had a friend who sent me something that was misinformation. It was a meme shot of the president of Turkey saying, we're going to defend the Palestinians at all costs. And the first thing I said to myself is, you know, I'm not an expert on the nation of Turkey, but I've seen the news enough and that guy enough to know that he seems pretty measured. I don't think he'd be saying that. And of course, boom, I do a fact check and it's misinformation. I had another call with a friend of mine who's Israeli, who was beside himself and distraught, telling me about how he saw a video of a kid in a cage and in Gaza and all that, that was kidnapped. And I go do the fact check on that, and that was also misinformation. And I'm reading online about how many videos, like there was a video apparently of a young girl who was 16 years old being lynched in Guatemala in 2015. And that video has been circulating online now as proof of what the Hamas has done with some of the hostages. And so what I'm saying is that I give the example of my two friends on opposite ends of this discussion and what they share with me, because as much as I might tell them that I found that it's fake, the fact that their brain already saw that and they already were in a position where they were conditioned to want to believe it, is what we're seeing is the ultimate confirmation bias, like in human history with this conflict and with the way that images are proliferating, because it's hard to not see something once you saw it.
Well, no. Remember, this was studied when we talked about the Russian model, the fire hose of falsehood. One of the things they had discovered, well, that they were leveraging, is the fact that the reporting of something or the seeing something, your brain remembers more than subsequently learning that it wasn't true. And so that was always their incentive to get the part of the fire hose of falsehood was get out there quick and get out there repeatedly, because even if later it comes out that what you're saying isn't true, people won't remember that it came out that it wasn't true. All they'll remember is what they originally saw, and like you pointed out, their emotional feeling, their emotional reaction to that. And so, I mean, we're in a situation basically, and I want to get to the next topic, but I just summing it up. Like, we're in a situation where we can't trust what we see, even though it's going to influence us. Like, it's going to change us. It's going to imperceptibly change us, but we can't even trust what we see. And so, like, yeah, we're entering, like, I mean, this kind of undersells it, but we're entering the wild west of information in that kind of sense.
Just to finish off, one example for us at home, that's why I want to talk to fellow Americans, obviously, where we live here. I mean, think about the big lie. I mean, and the idea, like you're saying, about a narrative gets created, and then people don't, a lot of people just sort of get confused and decide, I want to just either shut it off or I don't believe anyone. And so it's very disruptive, and we've been subject to that.
And that can be used basically intentionally. Understanding that people will have those reactions can be used intentionally, which, interestingly enough, is a great segue to our second topic today, which gets into, we have, this is a legit academic, author, everything, who is coming out and saying he understands this is going to be inflammatory. But basically, his premise is that virtually all, as humans, not animal, like not animals like primates, stuff like that, but as humans, virtually all of our behaviors are beyond our conscious control. So, that basically saying there's no free will. So what were your thoughts, on now he's promoting a book. So, we obviously that's going to bring out when you're promoting a book, you're bringing out the most interesting stuff. But, so what are your thoughts? There was a write-up in the Los Angeles Times. We'll have that in the show notes, but what was your thoughts on this?
No, I thought it was very interesting. I mean, like you said, as a segue from the first topic.
Just real quick, the author's name, Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting because one of my friends, just in this heat of the last few weeks, sent me the documentary from YouTube, which I know is very famous, called Zeitgeist. And I saw this scientist was actually interviewed in that 20 years ago. He looks a bit younger.
Yeah.
So it's all interesting stuff, but no, I think it reinforces the type of scientific research we've seen in recent decades, especially with the ability of technology to help us see things like the brain scans and all that stuff that obviously even people like Sigmund Freud didn't have access to, seeing patterns of the brain and being able to ask people questions and when parts of the brain light up in milliseconds and all that. So I think it's been understood in recent decades, for people like us who find this stuff interesting, that we are a lot less able to make freely conscious decisions than we want to believe. The whole idea of how much your childhood impacts you, even when you're an adult, so on and so forth, I think all lends to that. This seems a bit radical, though, to say that, like, from birth to if you lived a full life expectancy to like 88 years old, that nowhere in that period of time did you have any free will.
Because it's an extreme. Yeah. I mean, like, you go from most people in studying this kind of agree that there are a lot more going into our decisions. Like, we have much less control than we think. But he's going all the way to the end of the road saying there's none.
Yeah, so, no, that's what I mean. Is that seems a little bit extreme to hear that.
It's jarring. It's jarring.
But once you read into the way he explains it, I mean, again, I'm not going to say, oh, I believe it just because he's a scientist and he said this, but I am going to say, I mean, it's plausible, right? I mean, I'd like to believe I have a certain level of autonomy and free will, but also understanding, like we say, human nature, the influence that we all have from our environment, our surrounding world, that there's a lot of things that influence us. And I think going back to just the discussion we had in part one, like when you said imperceptible changes. Yeah. Those things begin. So whether it is a certain level of addiction,
by the way, just let me make the connection. By saying imperceptible changes in behavior, implicit in that is a lack of free will. Like that, just they're like that because it's imperceptible. That means you're not aware of it happening, and that's kind of what that's similar to what this guy's saying, is that we're just not aware of the things that are causing us to make these decisions. They're in our unconscious, not in our conscious part of our brain.
Yeah, so, no, and I think, well, that's what I'm saying. Whether it be an addiction to social media or that stuff, or an addiction to cigarettes, right? I think the idea of imperceptible changes having a perceptible outcome at some point is real, which is a good example. If we could extrapolate that into other areas of life, then I guess, you know, if my inability to control myself from smoking a cigarette, that may then lead to me having a falling out with a spouse who doesn't like smoking, or may lead to me meeting someone because we stopped at a rest stop to smoke a cigarette and we ended up meeting there, right? Which may then lead to something else. So I could sit there and tell you, James, it was my own free will and accord as to exactly why I married my wife. But maybe the way this guy's,
but you weren't given the
no,
meter.
wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was the fact that I couldn't control smoking a cigarette, and I ended up at a rest stop and happened to stand next to a woman and start talking to her, and then we got, you know, we do end up having a good relationship and get married. So,
well, but
is that my free will or not? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
That's, you know.
But to me, that's kind of where that's the interesting part of this is you're getting into the weeds between influence, which there can be multiple factors of influence, and actually control. Where does influence end? Like, things can influence you to make a decision, or to, you know, can influence your circumstances to where you if you're in circumstance A, you'll make decision A. If you're in circumstance B, you'll make decision B. So factors can influence that versus control. And to me, I mean, it's interesting that he throws it out there, but I mean, what he's throwing out there is impossible to prove, in my opinion. Like, if you're anytime you're going all or nothing, then you're setting yourself up, particularly from a science standpoint, like a scientific standpoint. It'd be like me saying 100% for sure there's life in this galaxy, or 100% sure there's not life in this galaxy. I mean, like, that's, you know, like that's it's much safer from a scientific standpoint and more easily verifiable to say there probably is or there probably isn't. Because, you know, am I going to visit the billions of planets in the, you know, the galaxy to prove it right or to prove it wrong? So anytime you're on the extreme of all or nothing, and the reason I'd say it like that is because let's say that his research, he's able to verify that 99% of the decision you make is based on factors out of your control. And then there's 1% that he can't prove, that is like, that 1% is kind of in this consciousness thing. Like, we can't figure out, well, where does that 1% go? Because different people might react in different ways that aren't necessarily fully explained by their circumstances. That 1% then is, if you have 1% control over your decision and 99% is based on other factors, is that free will? You know, and I would say it is, you know, like, because again, it's a given that so many different factors relate to how it is we make our decisions. So many things that we're not aware of, whether it be, as you point out, childhood, whether it be circumstances, whether it be you meet your example with the, okay, I met somebody at a rest stop or whatever. How you react to that person deals or will be affected by your last interaction with somebody. You know, if you just got off the phone and get an argument, yada, 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 going back and forth, then you come into somebody, you're talking to them, you're going to be a different person than if you just got off, oh yeah, wow, you just, you know, you graduated from school, that's the best thing ever. Like, you're going to be in a different place. You know, you're the same person, you know, so all of these factors aren't going to be, you don't go in when you start talking to that person and control necessarily where you're coming from an emotional standpoint. So all of that stuff, again, I look at this as wild to see, but also pretty much like, oh yeah, of course, you know, in the sense that, yes, most of the factors behind how we end up what we end up or what we're deciding to do are things we're not controlling. But again, if it's 99% and 1%, that's still free will.
Yeah. And I mean, he talks about that a bit. I think you're right, though. That's why the idea of being absolute, because I keep thinking about the first topic he did, and I thought, yeah, to be absolute on a topic like that is going to get you in trouble. You know,
well, it gets you in trouble, but it's not, because it's going to be put. How are they going to prove him wrong? You know, like, again, it's you know, so no, that's what I mean
is that, but that's why your analogy of life in the galaxy outside of obviously the Earth makes sense, because to be absolute one way or another, it's at least at this point in our technology, it's impossible to prove.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same thing with this. I mean, the brain, I mean, they call it a 3-pound universe, right? The brain is almost like another universe, like from the inside. So it's probably, we're at that point too, where we're not at a point yet we can really know what's going on in the brain 100%.
Yeah.
So,
and then beyond that, remember, one of the things that if you look at us, one of the other things that's going on is the whole idea of self-awareness, you know, like, in that just thinking about the idea of whether or not you have control influences the level of control you can exert.
That now you're going to quantum physics, like
exactly. It's in the next
splitting,
level now.
Just observing it is going to change it.
Exactly.
Which is a whole different concept, and that's
which, by the way, great pull. great pull. The quantum part, and observing and changing. Yeah.
So now we got to have a different show, which means we got to stop this one, because now I got to have a whole show about the double split experiment.
Yeah, no, for sure.
No, but it's look, it's fascinating. I think just that's why I found the topic interesting, because not to just keep going back to part one, but this idea that we now can see just in this period of the last 15 years or so with social media, we have everybody listening to this knows somebody, whether yourself or someone else, that you've watched change in a certain way, hopefully for the better, but a lot of times maybe more negative, due to their interaction with the internet, period. So we know that people can change, and in their mind, they're in control. They're going to tell you, no, I know this is right. I know this is right. But you're looking at the same person that you knew from 10, 15 years ago and saying, no, you would have never thought this was correct, or you wouldn't have been this rabid about it, or this extreme, or this emotional connected to it prior to these influences, which you don't seem to perceive yourself have moved you from point A to point B.
No, I remember that was studied even outside of the context of social media. That was studied in the context of the news media, where this was a recent study, maybe in the last year or two, where they took Fox News viewers and had them, documented kind of their positions on things, took them out of that Fox News environment, and just had them watch regular news for a period of time. And then when they came back, what they found is that their politics, so to speak, didn't change, but how they, how far along the line they went did change, and they're not aware of this, so it's like, even that's not just limited to social media. Social media, like I said, is just it's much more effective at it than any media before it, in the same way that television was much more effective than the media before it, same way that radio was effective more. It's just we are living through one of the next major jumps in media. And so that's going to affect how we perceive things. But no, we got to get out of here, man. It's
quick, that study was 4 weeks. That's what's crazy about it.
Yeah, it happened over 4 weeks. Yeah,
that's how quickly people change. So I mean these are things that it doesn't take years for people to get into
and change and not even know that they changed, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
That affects how we view, from a media standpoint, but that also, it goes into, the free will mindset. Like, again, the person who 4 weeks ago, or before the study, that person might have made decision A in a certain situation, whereas 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, they may make a different decision. So how much does free will play in that versus how much who they are at that moment? So, these things you can keep digging and digging and digging. I don't think there is a bottom yet, but we gotta get out of here today.
A rabbit hole.
Yeah, that is why they call it a rabbit hole. But we're going to close up shop here. We do appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Till next time, I'm James Keys.